It feels like we've waited 366 times 2 for this year. Plenty of time to rethink your grand entrance. In you enter. They think you're going in for a bear hug, you run for it, secretly slipping a holiday scratcher in both back pockets, boom. That entrance would be money, like top prizes ranging from $500 to $500,000. Play along with holiday scratchers from the Virginia Lottery at a retailer near you. For odds and more information, visit VALottery.com.
With classes in crisis communication, influence, and data presentation, Gonzaga University's online Masters in Communication and Leadership equips you with the tools you need to communicate clearly and encourage creativity in any industry. Concentrations in digital media, strategic communication, and global leadership allow you to customize your degree. Visit gonzaga.edu/communication and learn why a master's degree from Gonzaga can help you take your career to the next level. That's gonzaga.edu/communication.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Elmo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. Welcome to Elmo's World Podcast. This is Elmo, and I am with my awesome guest, Michael Jones, commonly known as Inspiring Philosophy. Hey Michael, how you doing, man?
Yeah, it's been fine. I mean, I work from home as it is.
So what would be the most starting point that every human being should have when trying to understand and trying to get to the truth, the ultimate truth of what is real and everything about like life's big questions? So where's the starting point there?
Well, the starting point is definitely with yourself. It's the Cartesian notion, I think, therefore I am. Without that, we can't really have any sort of foundational beliefs. So you have to know that you exist before you can ever experience anything.
What about the critiques on it? Like for let's say like Rousseau or other critiques on the thing, I think, therefore I am. What's your response about that?
Well, they say there's assumptions that go to that, but of course the reply is, well, who's assuming? Who is making these assumptions? Well, there's got to be an I there. So Thomas Nagel has written a book called The Last World, where he points out a lot of skeptics and relativists are sort of pulling the rug out from themselves. They're saying you have to assume there's an I, but then the question, of course, is who's assuming there's an I? Well, there's obviously a you there that has to experience these things and make these questions. So you have to. It's impossible to deny there's not an I there, and so that's his basic point.
So there is an I, there is a me, and I think the next question is like, what am I doing here? Like, why do I exist? What would be the next question after that?
Well, we can't really know purpose from that, but I mean, the next question or the next answer is also part of the Cartesian notion. It's you have to accept that you are experiencing stuff. It could all be an illusion. You could be a brain in a vat, being tricked by an evil demon, but you're still experiencing something. So regardless of what it actually is, you still know you're experiencing. And so that's the next part of the Cartesian notion, that you have to be experiencing something. It's not just you. There's obviously information. Deriving
from that, right? Like, I am someone who's experiencing something. I could be a brain in a vat. I could be, it could all be as just an illusion. So, but where does that get us then? Like, because if I'm just, I could just be a brain in a vat.
Well, so the next step we can talk about is something called particularism. Now, particularism in epistemology is a reply to skeptics. Skeptic will say you can't know, certain things. You can't know that logic actually works. You can't know that you are actually experiencing real stuff. You can't know any sort of knowledge. The particularist replies with turning that around the skeptic, who says, there's no reason to deny what I'm experiencing is actually happening, or that I'm not experiencing real stuff and logic is actually working, until the skeptic can give us a good reason to deny logic. So you could say, so I use the example, let's take a look at A theory and B theory of time. Intuitively, we experience time on a model that would be similar to A theory. But science would tell us that B theory is more likely. So we have a reason to deny our intuitive understanding of time. The skeptic doesn't really give any sort of reason to deny logic or knowledge or justification or these type of things, other than the mere possibility. So the particularist replies by going, until you give me a good reason to distrust knowledge or logic, I'm not going to doubt these things. So it's sort of turning the thing on the skeptic. We're going to go on what our intuitions tend to tell us until we get a good reason to deny them. And so, of course, for some intuitions, we can overturn them and say, well, I'll deny this intuition, like maybe say when it comes to A theory of time, but I'm not going to deny my intuition on the fact that I'm a conscious being who has free will, who is experiencing a world outside of himself, unless the skeptic will give me a reason to doubt it.
Are you then saying that you're holding the particularist's view on accepting all the things that appear to be true intuitionally?
Yeah, you're going to accept your intuitions on these things until the skeptic can give us a reason to deny it. So we're going to start with our intuitions because that's our starting point. You start with your basic intuitions, not the world. And then science, reasoning, experience can overturn some of those types of intuitions, but it doesn't overturn all intuitions.
So in this sense though, right, like as if you're going to hold the particularist view in contrast to a skeptic's view, like I would also think about like what tools or instruments they use in order to and why they're holding their particular position, right? For a skeptic, he might just be like being intellectually I guess like honest when he says that I'm not really sure of this or that, so I'm not really gonna make a burden of proof. But for a particularist, okay, he's going to accept what seems to be true to him intuitionally. So, but he knows for a fact that he might be wrong, and he has no good reason to say that he's not wrong. Did you get all that?
Right. Well, I understand what you're kind of getting at. Yeah, the skeptic is, of course, not wrong in saying that we could be wrong about knowledge and justification. It's entirely possible. But that's just simply not how we act. That's simply, there's an old saying that actions speak louder than words. And I think that should apply in philosophy in a lot of ways. The skeptic doesn't actually live their life as if they can't have knowledge or justify certain things. They live as if these things are just intuitively there, and that's just simply the case. We don't actually live like the skeptic theorizes. We live as if we do have knowledge that we are actually experiencing an external world. It's not just an illusion. We're not just like, a solipsist or a brain of that kind of thing. So for the skeptic, they're pushing philosophy they themselves don't actually live out. And so it's just impossible to actually live that way. It's impossible to actually think that way. So why go along with that just because it's possible? I mean, it's entirely possible that the dinosaurs never existed and Satan just planted all the bones in the earth to trick us. It's entirely possible that the world is 2,000 years old and just popped into existence. But we don't actually live like that's actually the case. We follow the evidence where it leads. And if the evidence indicates that it's 4.6 billion years old, we say it's probably 4.6 billion years old. We don't go, well, it could possibly be 6,000, 25,000, who knows? So let's not make any conclusions. It's not how we reason.
I guess then you're sort of holding skeptics accountable, right? Like, oh, you live like this, you live according to the evidence and all that, and you deny all the other possible things because and accept things that in your normal life seem to be true. So it's either you're cognitively dissonant and you believe contradictions, or you have to follow the evidence and actually follow where the evidence leads you, and it leads you to all these things that you have to accept and can't deny. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and also the skeptic, of course, as you sort of hinted at, is sort of falling into a contradiction in a lot of these ways. If we can't have any knowledge or we can't know that something is actually the case, then that proposition cannot be known. So in other words, if all knowledge is beyond our grasp, and so is that claim that all knowledge is beyond our grasp. So you can't actually state that that's actually the case.
I don't think all atheist skeptics say that, like all knowledge, that there can't be any knowledge that we can grasp. I think most of them are saying that, until we can actually say 100% that this is true, so we have to accept that there is still a possibility that we could be wrong. I don't think that they hold the knowledge premise that you say they do.
Well, there's different types, to be fair. There's ancient skeptics or modern skeptics. There's not just one skeptic. I'm talking about a more like a general type of flavor kind of here. There are different types. But again, if they're claiming that we don't have 100% knowledge on these types of things, that in itself is a claim. Like, you're claiming that that's actually 100% the case. And so, like, you can't, this is one of the things Nail's pointing out in his book, that all of these types of claims, no matter how you word it, you're going to be making some sort of knowledge claim that this is the case of the way things are. Even if it's something simple like, well, we can't know that these certain things are true, or there's just certain things beyond our grasp. If certain things are beyond our grasp, then how do you know that claim is not beyond our grasp? So would you state that as a fact? So it's very hard for the skeptic to make these kind of claims without making absolute or knowledge claims themselves. So they're pulling the rug out from under themselves.
Okay, so in a sense, you're sort of criticizing the general skeptics that say that you have to be coherent with everything, like with all the claims that you make, right? And if you claim that you make this knowledge claim that there are things that are outside of their grasp, therefore you have to follow the logical entailments for that. And if it contradicts with some things that you say, then you're just, you don't make sense. You're irrational.
Yeah, it can collapse to irrationality in some cases. But then again, it also falls back to the particularist. The burden of proof is going to be on the skeptic. It's not on the particularist to make the case. Why are we going to doubt our intuitions when they've not really given us a reason to, other than the mere possibility they could be wrong? So the particularist is actually saying the burden is on the skeptic here. Just because they can show that we don't know 100%, doesn't mean we should doubt these things or assume that it's not the case. The skeptic is trying to pretend the burden is on the particularist, and that just, in my view, is not fair. It's not actually the way reasoning works.
I think you might be saying that both sides have a burden of proof, right? If you're a particularist or a skeptic, you will have a burden of proof. Like for a particularist, whatever claim and the logical conclusion they're following, they have a burden of proof for that. And skeptics who are trying to sort of dismantle what a particularist is trying to make, they also have a burden of proof to prove that, or at least on their side as well.
Well, it depends on the specific claim each side is making. The claim the skeptic is constantly making that we have no reason to make these sort of inferences because we don't have 100% knowledge on certain things. I feel like the burden is more on the skeptic. Now, there are some claims, of course, the particularists need to provide evidence for. But if we're talking about basic intuitions, like your and my intuitions, I don't feel like the particularist has to make the burden of proof there, because your intuition is your starting point. So even determinists will admit in a lot of ways that they have to make the burden that free will is an illusion. Why? Because everyone sort of intuitively believes they have free will. It's not on me to start off with the burden of proof to show that we have free will. Now, we have a burden to meet maybe objection for determinists to start back free will, because they don't just argue, the mere possibility. They actually offer some good arguments that proponents of free will need to address, whether you're a compatibilist or a libertarian in that sense. So there still is a burden in that sense, but it's not so much the idea that we have to just, if somebody raises a possibility, the mere possibility that knowledge could be wrong, it's not our job to say, okay, I have a burden. No, the burden is on the person who raised the objection to knowledge.
So, okay, in this sense though, right, like I want to ask you what your particular basic intuitions that you hold? Maybe so, maybe it doesn't have to be exhaustive, but what particular intuitions are we talking about here?
Well, let's start with the basic ones. Like we already went over the Cartesian notions that I exist and I'm experiencing stuff. I don't doubt that my cognitive faculties are working. I don't doubt that there's an external world beyond my mind.
So what would be those basic intuitions?
So basic intuitions, like we already noted, are the Cartesian notions, like I exist and I'm experiencing something. I have no reason to doubt that my cognitive faculties are working. I would add in free will. There's no reason for me to doubt my free will. There's no reason for me to doubt that I'm an agent experiencing stuff, that my cognitive faculties work, that there's an external world beyond my single mind, that there are other conscious agents like you or any other person in existence. So those are some basic intuitions that we sort of have. And the skeptic will, in some ways, or different skeptics will want you to doubt certain aspects of that. And the particular says you've not really given any strong reason beyond the mere epistemic possibility. So why should I doubt that?
But here's a thought, like I would want you to sort of think, discuss. It's like I would say that everybody has these presuppositions, these basic intuitions. Like even a skeptic would hold at least a couple of what you said about, like what notions that you also said, they would agree, right? But when it comes to the uniformity in which particular intuitions we all should have, and we can't really deny ever, and if we do deny them, our rationality collapses or incoherence, and we make contradictions. So which particular intuitions do you say that every skeptic can't escape?
Every skeptic can escape? Yeah, I would say the fact that there are laws of logic. So like Thomas Nagel, this is one of the main points of this book, is like it's impossible to doubt that 2 + 2 = 5, or that 2 + 2 = 4. You can't think of a possible world where 2 + 2 = 5, and that makes logical sense. It just simply flows from the basic points of logic. It just doesn't exist in another possible world. So like in a logical absurdity, like when someone says 2 + 2 = 5, Richard Swinburne says it's not really a logical, it's not really something that can exist. It's just a collection of words that's formulated in a sentence that purports to describe something, but doesn't really describe anything in reality. It's just a trick of the mind. So basic logic, I feel like you can't deny. Basic understanding that there are absolutes, you cannot deny, because the very claim there are no absolutes is an absolute. So it's impossible to get around that fact, according to Nagel and other philosophers like Swinburne.
How about this though? Like, how would you sort of school an atheist and say that, okay, you can't deny that there are laws of logic, and I think any skeptic would agree with you that yes, there are laws of logic, and I have to abide with them. But how would you lead them with the laws of logic to a point, let's say, that a theist that would help them lean towards theism? Is that?
I don't know that. Yeah, I mean, some people use the tag the transcendental argument. I'm not a proponent of that argument because I feel like it's begging the question. So I wouldn't use those kind of arguments against an atheist. I mean, Thomas Nagel, who I've been talking about, is an atheist. So I don't use these types of arguments against atheism because I don't feel like those are sufficient reasons to get to God. I mean, I would use more arguments from natural theology for that.
You say that there are these basic intuitions, right? Free will, there are other conscious minds, there's an external world, and laws of logic. Where do we go after this? Like, does it mean that, okay, I have these basic intuitions, so I'm gonna use them as tools, in order for me to understand and arrive at ultimate reality and determine what it is, its characteristic.
So, I mean, I would go back to particularism. I mean, there's no reason to doubt these sort of things. So until the skeptic is a good reason, we're going to continue to use our cognitive faculties, our reasoning capabilities to explore the external world beyond us and find out what is most likely the case, what is the most likely worldview.
Yeah, so if you're coming from a particular point of view, then you are someone who holds all these basic intuitions. So I want to ask then, like, why do you believe in God? what's the foundations for believing in a deity?
Well, when we study the external world, study things about ourselves, I would say there are things that are best explained by a theistic worldview that a naturalistic or materialistic worldview cannot explain. So it also can be, theist also can invoke parsimony in a lot of ways. So there are things like the origin of the universe, consciousness, objective moral values and duties. These types of things are best explained from a theistic worldview, and a naturalistic or an atheistic worldview has to accept that these things are just either brute facts or unexplainable, and so the theistic worldview can explain far more with far less, covering all sorts of different aspects of reality that the atheist has to, or the naturalist has to sort of brush away without a proper explanation.
Mm-hmm. So in this sense, you're holding the view, the position that a theistic worldview can explain reality a lot better compared to any other worldview, right? So that's why you're holding it, and the critiques that skeptics make against theistic worldviews are just not enough for you to leave it, right?
Yeah. So natural theology has arguments like contingency arguments. What gave rise to the universe? Okay, and then they also have arguments: what gave rise to consciousness? What gave rise to objective moral values and duties? Why is there fine tuning even, and that sort of thing there? The atheist or the naturalist will have a different explanation for all these things. So somehow the brain is able to generate consciousness and get around the heart problem. Somehow the universe came into existence. What are objective moral values and duties? Well, there's various explanations for that. The atheist will offer another one. The theist is actually explaining all of these with one explanation, and I would say it's a much better explanation than some of the ones the atheist can offer, like take consciousness. There's just no evidence the brain can generate consciousness. It's just assumed that there's material matter in the brain and that a miracle happens and you get consciousness. This is why it's called the hard problem. Our intuitive understanding of consciousness implies that it's not reducible to smaller parts. It just simply is. And that can be better explained by a conscious source that we would call God. Same with the origin of the universe. When atheists start offering explanations for the origin of the universe, it starts to sound very much like God. They'll offer some sort of like material substance that's able to act on its own and create things, which is very close to the idea of a mind creating things, because minds are the only things we intuitively know in existence. It can bring things into existence without being acted upon. So a lot of these things are sort of, a lot of the arguments atheists use don't really ground the problem of theism, and so I would say theism is just a simple explanation that can necessarily explain all the data.
Okay, so two things here. I want to ask you one about theism and another about atheism. So firstly, atheism, since we're going on this route, like how would you define what an atheist is? Because I think there are two kinds of atheists. One is an agnostic and a gnostic atheist. So which ones in particular are you saying that are make no sense, I guess, or at least wrong?
Well, I'm just talking about these sort of in general. But I mean, for an atheist, they would say there is no God, and an agnostic would say they're not sure if a God exists or not. Now, for the agnostic, it doesn't really help because they're just sort of saying, I don't know, and they're not really offering an explanation, which is fine. You can be agnostic, but that's not going to show that the theistic explanation is not the best inference. You're just not personally accepting what we're saying is the best inference. And if you're really agnostic, you can't really even claim that it's not the best inference because you're agnostic. How would you know? So it doesn't really get around the claims that way either. I don't really see how that is really, it doesn't really change much from my perspective.
So, okay, so for the theism though, I like the way you put it that for all these questions, big questions in life like objective, for morality, for consciousness, for the universe, and on all that, that theists have one big answer for all of this, like a one size fits all. But for atheists, they have to sort of like make a jigsaw puzzle that isn't actually coherent. So in this sense, you are putting like a standard for atheists that they have to make sense of everything. Like for their whole worldview, there has to be at least it has to make sense, coherence and consistency.
Right. And so, well, not only that, it's not only parsimony. I'd say that the theistic worldview is more in line with our intuition of certain things. Like, again, going back to consciousness, there's just no evidence consciousness can be produced by the brain, other than you just assume that it is. You just assume because you presuppose naturalism, therefore it has to come from the brain somehow. And there's just no, this is why it's called a hard problem, because there's just no evidence or reasonable inference in how the brain could produce consciousness. It's a hard problem, it's a hard problem for those very reasons. So, the atheist is just, or the naturalist, materialist, whoever you're, will just sort of assume, well, a miracle happens. Okay, well, that's not really an explanation. And maybe I'm being a little harsh, but that's essentially, in my view, what it boils down to. Because there's no evidence the brain produces consciousness. You're assuming somehow subjectiveness just sort of comes out of matter, and there's just no way that we can explain that. So there's that issue there. And the theists, when they offer their explanations, they're explaining a much more coherent worldview with regards to a lot of those types of things. And I go through into this in a lot of videos around. It's not just simply, God of the gaps, like, well, we don't know where consciousness comes from, therefore God. It's more of like, okay, what do we know about consciousness? Well, we know it's irreducible, it's subjective, it's being self-aware. Since it cannot come from matter, it's likely to come from a personal source. Okay, well, a personal source of consciousness would be a conscious being named God. Same with the origin of the universe. It's not we're saying we don't know where it came from, therefore God. It's, okay, well, we know about these types of things. Well, the universe comes into existence. It eventually has to be a first cause. The universe was caused by a multiverse, caused the multiverse, et cetera, et cetera. So the first cause. Well, what would be the ontology of the first cause? Well, it would have to cause itself to act, because it can't be acted upon by something else, because it has to be the first cause. So it has to be able to act upon itself to create contingent things. Well, that sounds very much like a mind. A mind is able to act upon itself to do certain things. A mind doesn't have to be caused by other things. You're self-aware. You can just go and do things on your own without being forced by something else. So the very ontology of these things implies a mind is behind these things. Theists are not just saying, well, I don't know how to explain consciousness, therefore God. I don't know how to explain the universe, therefore God. We're saying the very ontology, or the very reason, the intuitive understanding of these things implies a theistic world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I guess that when it comes to consciousness, it's a huge topic to cover, but okay, I want to ask you about three topics that you mentioned, and one of this is consciousness, but I want to go with morality first, and then a fine-tuning question, and then consciousness. But because I really want to know your take on the moral systems that non-theists make, or at least also the critiques on theistic claims on morality, especially objective morality. So my question on morality is what do you say about the Euthyphro dilemma? I think that's one of the most basic things that they ask about a Christian when you say that, I'm making moral claims and my moral system is coherent and everything, but the skeptic's gonna say but with your moral system doesn't make sense too, like mine, so we're no different from each other.
Right, so the Euthyphro dilemma can only be sort of offered if you're sort of beyond arguing for objective morality. If someone is going to, or a subjectivist, relativist, non-cognitivist, I'm not going to argue for objective morality with them, or I'm not going to argue for God, because they're not even accepting that there is objective morality. So when they sort of offer, they're sort of saying okay, so if morality is objective, how is it grounded in God? And the Euthyphro dilemma is does God do the good because he is conforming to it, or does he arbitrarily sort of set God from it, or arbitrarily set the good from the will? So that's the Euthyphro dilemma. Now that can easily be turned on a non-theistic worldview that accepts objective morality. Are the objective moral values and duties arbitrary, or are they conforming to something that is, or are these rules conforming to something that is good? It doesn't really get around the problem. Euthyphro dilemma you can easily use an Euthyphro dilemma on a non-theistic non-natural, moralistic worldview. So it doesn't really get around the issues, I would say. The other thing to point out is that my position is God is the same as the good. So when we study the ontology of what goodness is, it just reveals a theistic type proponent or opponent there. So think of objective prescriptions. I could give you a prescription to not to maybe like watch my kid. Okay, now you have been prescribed that from me to you. Prescriptions exist between agents. They don't exist in a vacuum. Again, they exist between two agents. So if we have objective prescriptions, where are they objectively coming from? Well, it implies that the prescriptions imply they would come from a mind with obligations and whatnot. So there's obviously a moral ontology behind this sort of goodness that we're talking about. And so my position is God is the same as goodness. It's not that goodness is like grounded in God. I would say they're equivalent. It's like finding out that water and H2O are the same thing. The goodness simply is God and God is goodness. And so think of it like this, like a good analogy is think of your personality in you. Your personality is grounded in you, but it's still you, and you would not be who you were without your personality. So likewise, the goodness is sort of grounded in God in that sort of same way. It just simply is him. That is what goodness essentially is. And I go into this in a lot more detail in my video, Is God the Same as Moral Goodness? And I sort of explain why God is.
Equivalent doesn't really mean identical, right? It's different.
No, not necessarily. I mean, you maybe could make the case that they're identical. But no, I would say that there's an epistemic slight difference, just like you could say you have a personality. You implies a epistemic separation between you and your personality. But when you start to think about your personality, it cannot really be divorced from it, and you still you.
So in this sense, when we talk about goodness, we're actually talking about like an aspect of God, right? Like it's not identical to God. Like goodness isn't God, but God is sort of, I don't want to say part, but it's actually sort of part. Is that what you're saying? Like goodness is part of God?
Yeah, it's hard to explain it, sure. But yeah, I would say it's an aspect of God, the source of all. Mm-hmm. He's the source of goodness. He is the source of all. So goodness would be, of course, grounded in him in that sense. If you want to say grounded, fine. When people hear the word grounded, they immediately want to jump to the Euthyphro dilemma without actually understanding what we mean by saying God is grounded.
But this doesn't really answer the Euthyphro dilemma, though, because I think the Euthyphro dilemma is actually saying like, hey, if God is referring to himself, to an aspect of himself as the objective moral standard, then it is within the subject of God. Your objective morality is in fact a subjective morality, right? It doesn't really escape, I think, from how I look at it and how you put it.
Well, I think that first of all, they're assuming some sort of reductionism, and they're assuming God is just sort of like a big human agent. Mm-hmm. And that's not, of course, what these are saying. God is not a giant human agent, and we are not arguing for reductionism in the sense that somehow everything has to constantly be reducing. So no, I don't really think that works because, again, we're talking about a being that is, of course, the first cause, that is the grounding of all goodness in what sense. So the buck's got to stop somewhere, and they don't want the buck to stop somewhere. It's got to be a reductionist kind of position there. So I don't really think it works because, again, I think God is goodness. God is what it is to be good. God simply is goodness. It's not that the goodness is sort of somehow separate from God in that sense.
I would say there's sort of a mystery on how this works, but okay, let's say that this is the case. Okay, like my I think it boils down how we define God, right? Because if it's like if on how an atheist would understand God, it's just like a big human agent. But as a Christian, right, as a theist, how would you define God in this sense for it to actually sort of make sense on God being goodness and actually not being a subject but something more?
Well, I think if we're talking about moral values and duties, I think it's more important on how we define them because again, it's not so much starting with God, it's starting with what is the ontology of goodness. And there is an agent aspect in there. I mean, objective prescriptions, objective obligations don't exist just somehow floating in an ether. Prescriptions can only exist between agents. So the argument is that if objective prescriptions exist, they would have to be agent-like, or be an aspect of an agent in that sort of sense. So the very ontology of goodness in the idea of objective duties implies that there is something beyond ourselves, something beyond us that is an agent. So the argument from objective moral values and duties is not just, well, let's just ground these in God because it's easy. It's that the very ontology of goodness implies an agent-like aspect.
Okay, I do accept that, yes. Okay, if we define moral values as a prescription, yes, it does require there to be two agents, right? One may be humanity and other God. But it still doesn't answer the question of, okay, so how can we sort of mix like God being the objective standard and God as not being just a subject, like a big human agent? How would you define God then?
Well, I mean, I'm not saying God's just an object. I'm saying God is a subject. It's just not a subject that's like a human, like a contingent. It's a necessary being. So God definitely is a subject. God is mind. I'm not saying he's not.
So God is a subject, but he's a different kind of subject from a human subject?
Right, because God is necessary. God would be outside of time. God would simply be a mind. He did not come into existence. So it's not like God has to learn anything as he goes through time like we do.
Mm-hmm. So in the sense, like, God is sort of an exception to the term, to how we define subject, or as what a subject.
I mean, the way I wouldn't put it that way, because it's not an exception like we just sort of making excuses. The very ontology of the first cause, the grounding of goodness, would imply that this being would have to be different. Again, we're starting with what we find in reality, like the origin of the universe, consciousness, objective moral values and duties, and the ontology of these things would imply an agent is there.
Okay, so an agent is there, and yes, but God is also a subject, but he's not the same subject as how we would define a human as a subject, right? Just to be clear on that.
Right, because God is not a contingent being.
So if this is, I guess, like, if this is the main argument against objective morality, this is the one thing that I get a lot. Okay, so how would you then sort of criticize, like, oh, you also make moral claims as an atheist, but your subjective moral system doesn't make sense, or is actually irrational? How would you point that out to them, at least?
Well, it goes back to the objective prescriptions. I mean, what do they just exist in the ether somewhere? Why do we have objective prescriptions? If you believe morality is objective, it's grounded in a non-natural source, okay, then how? What is the moral ontology we're talking about? So we just have to start with what the ontology of what objective values and duties would look like. And as I've argued in my video, is God the same as moral goodness? It would be personal, subjective. It would be a mind, and just from the very ontology of studying just things like objective prescriptions or the objective ideal.
Yeah, and I think this is the case for most atheists, I guess, that I've talked to. Like, whenever I ask them about like the grounding of their moral system, it just doesn't make sense, I guess, for a lot of them. And it's either they say they don't really know where it comes from, or it's just, their subjectivity is in fact no different from a Christian's objective moral system, because God is also subjective. So, Michael, one last question before we end. It's been awesome talking to you, man. I want to ask you then, when it comes to the worldviews and everything, you do hold a particularist worldview and arguments for God. But I think your biggest argument is to skeptics, that they also have to have this burden of proof and actually prove and actually hold themselves accountable to their actions and what they should believe, So can you, I guess, what would be your closing remarks on this? To what would you say to a skeptic if they're going to say that I don't know, but I still disagree with you?
Well, my response is always, that's your right. You can believe whatever you want and follow the evidence to the logical inference, which is a theistic worldview. So Again, you can believe whatever you want. If you're not convinced, that's your subjective preference, but that's not going to debunk the arguments.
It's been awesome talking to you, IP. I really love your videos. I binged all of them. Like last year, it really helped me a lot with my faith too, and standing strong in the Christian position. And I hope you have a great day, man. You please keep doing your videos.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And thank you for listening in. And please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. Please follow this. Please. Thanks.
It's the holidays, which usually means employing your surprise face. But winter-winning scratchers are loaded with $500 prizes, so there's always a surprise. Unlike the 27th snowflake ornament from Grandma. Play along with holiday scratchers from the Virginia Lottery at a retailer near you. For odds and more information, visit VALottery.com.
Holidays are here, and so is fashionable fitness. Gift yourself a Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 3 5G, a phone that folds in half to literally stand on its own. Pair it with the Galaxy Watch 4 for ultimate wellness and wow factor. Check health stats, flex personal records. Over 90 activities can be tracked, like biking, swimming, golfing, and more. Invest in yourself with tech made to crush goals. Holidays open up with Galaxy. Shop it all at Samsung.com. 5G connection and availability may vary. Check with carrier. Products sold separately.